Hey guys, tonight we're stepping into the freezing black water nightmare of a disaster your medieval ancestors never understood and couldn't escape. The storm surge. You might picture a rising tide, some flooded streets, maybe a few fishing boats battered by waves. What really happened was nothing like that. It was the sea turning into a moving wall, smashing through homes, swallowing fields, and dragging whole villages into the dark. No warning, no escape, no mercy. This wasn't a rare catastrophe. It was a constant threat to anyone living by the coast. This is why you wouldn't survive a medieval storm surge. And by the end of tonight, you'll realize just how thin the line is between safety and the sea taking everything. So before you get too cozy, take a second to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy this strange little corner of quiet storytelling. And drop a comment with where you're listening from and what time it is for you. It's strangely comforting to know who else is drifting off with us around the world. Now get comfortable, let the day melt away, and we'll drift back together into the quiet corners of the past. The day begins in deceptive quiet. You're in a small medieval fishing village, the kind of place where the horizon is as familiar as your own hands, and the sea is both your pantry and your priest. The air smells of drying kelp and smoke from the morning's hearth fires. Nets hang in loose gray curtains along the shore, heavy with last night's catch and the scent of brine. Gulls wheel above you, their sharp cries cutting across the stillness, swooping to fight over fish guts tossed onto the sand. Men in wool tunics squat on overturned barrels, repairing torn mesh with fingers calloused into leather. Children chase each other barefoot over tide-smoothed stones, dodging puddles left by the retreating tide, their laughter folding into the low hum of the waves. It feels like a safe, ordinary day, the kind you've lived hundreds of times. There's no sound of an approaching storm, no sky-darkening wall of rain on the horizon. The wind drifts lazily in from the sea, carrying the faint tang of salt and something faintly sweet from the marshes beyond the dunes. The boats bob in the shallows, their tarred hulls creaking softly as if sighing in contentment. You have work to do, gutting fish, mending gear, salting down cod in barrels. But there's no urgency. The ocean is in one of her good moods. She looks almost docile, light playing on her surface in quicksilver ripples. You could almost believe she's benign, but the older men, the ones with faces carved by wind and eyes the color of wet slate, keep glancing seaward more often than usual. They mutter in the local dialect, low enough you can't make out the words, but you catch fragments. Tide's wrong, and too still. They don't say storm surge. They don't have the language for what's coming. They call it God's wrath, or the sea devil's breath, or simply the taking tide. It's not the kind of thing you can predict with numbers or instruments. Here, it arrives without warning, a thief that comes in daylight. In the absence of science, there are stories, tales of whole hamlets swallowed in a single afternoon, of ships found stranded in the middle of fields miles from the coast, of drowned cattle bobbing in orchards, bloated and eyeless. Children hear these stories by the fire on winter nights, and they're meant to frighten, but also to remind. The sea gives, the sea takes, and she has no interest in fairness. The villagers don't draw maps of past floods. They tell them in whispers and in scars. From where you stand, it's just another calm day, and you've grown too used to calm. You think you know the ocean because you've harvested her for years, walked her shorelines, survived her ordinary tempests. You've seen rough water batter the harbor, and you think that was the worst she could offer. You have no idea what's waiting for you just beyond the reach of your vision. The water is building herself elsewhere, silently, using wind and tide like a craftsman gathering his tools. Somewhere beyond the curve of the earth, a storm is clawing at the sea's surface, piling her into a wall you can't imagine, and when she's ready, she'll send it to find you. Your neighbor Agnes is standing knee-deep in the shallows, washing a bundle of laundry against the side of her skiff. She doesn't see it either, only notes that the waves seem to be pushing a little higher up the sand, making her lift the basket out of reach. She tells herself, it's nothing. The miller's boy walks past with a sack of grain on his back, grumbling about the softness of the tide. It should be going out by now, but it clings stubbornly to the shore. A dog barks at something unseen offshore, then whines and backs away from the waterline. The church bell rings, the same dull tone it's made for decades, summoning you to midday prayers. The sound folds into the murmuring surf, a kind of reassurance that the day is still your own. But something in you, something small and primal, feels unsettled. You can't name it, so you ignore it. That's what people do in places like this. The old fishermen might tighten their nets a little more than usual, or bring the goats inside for the night, but no one runs. Running from the sea is not something you do. If you could step outside yourself, outside this century, and see what's coming in the way modern eyes see weather patterns and tidal forces, you'd run until your lungs burst. But you don't have that gift. You have only the stillness, the gulls, the creak of boats, and the smell of fish drying on racks. You have the comfort of thinking the ocean is your neighbor, not your executioner. Tonight, you're going to meet the water the way your medieval ancestors did. Not as something you watch from behind glass or hear about on the news, but as a living thing that arrives without mercy, without warning, and without leaving you time to say goodbye. You live where the land stops and the sea begins, not because it's beautiful, but because there's no other choice. In your medieval world, the coast isn't a holiday destination. It's the only thing keeping you alive. The tides feed you, clothe you, heat your home, and, though you don't like to dwell on it, it could kill you just as easily. Your entire economy depends on that gray, restless border between earth and water. Fish pulled from the shallows are dried and salted for winter. Mussels and oysters are pried from rocks at low tide, and barrels of herring are loaded onto shallow draft boats for the markets upriver. Men mend nets with hands so callous they could be mistaken for old rope. Women boil seaweed into dyes or scrape salt from shallow evaporation pans. Every life here, from the oldest fisherman to the youngest child carrying driftwood, is tied to the rhythm of the tide. Your home squats just above the high water mark, a low timber frame packed with wattle and daub that smells faintly of smoke and damp even in summer. You didn't choose this spot because it's safe. You chose it because it's close enough to hear the change in the waves without stepping outside. No one in your village has heard of flood zones or storm surge hazard maps. Those are luxuries for people centuries in the future, people who have the time and wealth to draw lines on paper about where it's wise to live. Your decisions are simpler and harsher. Live by the water, or live too far to work it. If you live inland, you starve. If you live here, you eat. Most of the time. The boats are small, flat-bottomed things built to slip over sandbars and into tidal creeks, patched so often that no single plank can claim to be original. You use them to set nets, to check the fish traps woven from willow, to ferry sacks of salt to the nearest market town. On good days, the sea seems to reward your closeness with calm water and a steady catch. On bad days, she drags your boat sideways in the channel and reminds you she is not here to make friends. Still, you stay. Even the poorest plot of coastal ground is better than land miles inland, where you'd have to scratch at soil that barely grows onions and hope your lord doesn't decide he wants it back. There is no long-term planning here. No thought of building higher or moving further inland. The shore is where your family has lived for generations, and if the water took the house once, well, you rebuilt. What else is there to do? Every storm that blows in from the sea takes something, part of a wall, a section of roof, a row of drying racks, but never enough to drive you away. You tell yourself the danger is worth it. The sea may be fickle, but at least it's predictable in its own way. It comes in, it goes out, it leaves food behind. You can't say that about the Lord's tax collector. What you don't think about, or try not to, is how precarious your entire existence is. Every house here, every shed, every boat pulled above the tide line for safekeeping is part of a future casualty report waiting to happen. A storm big enough could erase the whole village in an afternoon, and there's nothing in your power to stop it. No walls, no warning, just the hope that when the next big wind comes, it's not from the wrong direction at the wrong time of year. You've heard stories from the old men about villages lost when the sea came too far in. The way they say it makes it sound like the sea just decided to take a walk inland, as if she were a neighbor who got curious. But the silences that follow those stories speak of something far less casual, and yet you don't leave. No one does. The risk is just part of life, like winter frost or summer drought. You've grown so used to the smell of salt in your walls and the hiss of the tide under the floorboards that you can't imagine living without it. Inland life seems foreign, untethered from the only rhythm you know. The horizon here may be dangerous, but it's yours. And so you keep your home planted right at the water's edge, certain the sea will give more than it takes, all the while ignoring the truth whispered in the old tales, that one day she will take everything and she won't give any of it back. You have no charts, no instruments, no maps smudged with inked lines of pressure and wind. There is no weather forecast to consult, no warning bulletin nailed to the church door, no voice on the air telling you to get to higher ground. Your entire understanding of what's coming from the sky is stitched together from old sayings, half remembered from your grandfather, and the things you notice while gutting fish or hauling nets. Red sky at morning, sailors take warning, they say, though no one in the village agrees on exactly how red is red enough to matter. If the sun rises behind a thick band of cloud and the light bleeds rust into the tide pools, some will mutter about rough seas. Others will just call it pretty and carry on with their work. There's no consensus here, only habit, and habit is stubborn. You watch the seabirds more than the sky. Gulls and terns are gossips of the wind, and when they fly inland in tight, agitated flocks, the older fishermen take notice. They claim the birds can smell the storm before you feel it, that the change in the air ruffles their feathers wrong. But birds fly inland for all kinds of reasons. Maybe the shoals are empty that morning. Maybe a bigger predator is out hunting in the bay. You've seen them flee before, only for the weather to stay calm for days. So when they spiral inland now, vanishing over the salt marsh, you shrug it off. Birds are birds. Animals closer to home carry their own signs, though you've learned not to put too much faith in them either. The goats in the pen will sometimes stand stock still, ears pricked at a sound you can't hear. The village dogs might growl at the horizon or whimper and tuck their tails. Once, you saw every chicken in the yard scuttle under the barn all at once, clucking like the devil was after them, and the next day was fine and sunny. So when the miller's dog starts barking at nothing, then slinks to the back of the yard with its head down, you don't take it as an omen. At most, you think it's strange, but strange is not enough to abandon the work that keeps you fed. Then there are the smells, the oddest and least trusted of the warnings. Sometimes the wind carries the thick, sour scent of deep-sea weed, like the tide dragged up the guts of the ocean. Other times it's a faint metallic tang, sharp enough to prickle the inside of your nose. You've heard people call it the smell of rain, or lightning, or God's breath. It's hard to tell one from the other, and easy to confuse the scent of a storm with the smoke from a neighbor's peat fire drifting the wrong way. Today, the wind smells different, but you can't pin down why. You inhale once, frown, and get back to sorting the morning's catch. Gossip runs faster than any breeze, and weather is one of its favorite subjects. By midday, 3 people have told you the tide will turn ugly by nightfall. 2 others swear the air feels too heavy and the gulls are up to something. But the baker says the sky looks fine to him, and the blacksmith laughs and says people always imagine danger when the work is dull. You find yourself somewhere in between. You've lived through enough storms to know they don't always announce themselves, but you've also been fooled enough times to know false alarms are common. There's a certain pride in not spooking too easily. You don't want to be the one who ran for no reason, so you go about your day. You shake the sand from the drying racks, patch the frayed end of a net, trade a few mackerel for a loaf of bread. The sky stays its same pale gray. The wind, steady enough to fill a sail but not enough to make the rigging sing. A stranger walking into the village now would think it was the picture of peace. Only if they lingered would they notice the undercurrent. The fishermen glancing at the horizon a little too often. The goats huddled together near the lee side of the barn. The way conversations trail off whenever a stronger gust rattles the thatch. But these are not the kind of things that send you running. Not yet. Because in your world, a bad feeling is not a forecast. It's just another piece of noise in the constant chatter between land, sea, and sky. You don't ignore it exactly, but you don't change your life around it either. And so the signs are seen, noted, and folded away in the back of your mind, while the real storm, patient, immense, and unseen, keeps building far beyond the limits of your sight. You live in the space the sea claims and releases twice a day, a strip of shifting ground that never really belongs to you. The intertidal zone is your workplace, your pantry, and your trap. At low tide, you walk out across the glistening mudflats to gather cockles and mussels, stepping carefully between patches that look solid, but will take your foot and try to keep it. Sometimes a man disappears up to his waist before anyone can reach him, flailing in the sucking mud, and even if they pull him out, he comes back smeared and shaken, like someone who has touched the hand of something that wanted him. You learn to read the ripples in the wet sand, to spot the dark seams that mark the edge of a channel. But no one is perfect, and the sea only needs one mistake. The channels are the worst. They snake through the flats in patterns that change with the season, and from the surface they can look no deeper than your ankle. Then you step in and drop to your chest in water that moves with a hidden current, fast enough to pull you under if you lose your footing. Children are told to stay away, but children follow their parents to the shore because there is work to do, and you can't afford to lose a morning's harvest to fear. You just watch your step and hope the ground holds. Even when the tide is out and the wind is low, the edge of the sea feels alive in a way that is not entirely friendly. Eels writhe in the shallows, crabs scuttle sideways under the kelp, and the water itself has moods you can't explain. One day it's clear and green, showing you every shell and stone on the bottom. The next it's clouded and restless, a shifting skin over depths you'd rather not imagine. You know it can rise faster than you can run if it chooses to, and so you keep one eye on the horizon when you work. That watchfulness becomes second nature, like breathing, and you don't think of it as fear, but it is. Your house sits just far enough up the bank to survive the ordinary tides, though that's never a guarantee. In spring, the higher waters lick at the base of the walls, and in winter the spray freezes on the doorframe in jagged sheets. The floor is never dry for long. Damp seeps up through the timbers until the boards swell and warp, leaving gaps wide enough for cold air to creep through. Mold grows in the corners no matter how often you scrub it away. The smell of salt and rot lingers year-round, a reminder that the sea does not stop at your threshold, not really. Roofs here are heavy with thatch, but storms tear at them like they're made of straw, and the timbers beneath grow soft over the years. Each one a little weaker than the last. You replace what you can when you have the means, but there's always something else in need of repair. An oar worn thin, a net with a hole big enough to lose a catch, a goat shed listing under its own weight. The truth is, the sea doesn't have to send a great surge to ruin your home. She's been doing it slowly since the day it was built, pulling it apart with damp, wind, and salt. And yet, you still work the tides because they're your livelihood. You time your days to them, measure your seasons by them, stake your life on the few hours they grant you to fish or gather before the water comes back in. Every family here has stories of people caught too far from shore when the tide turned. Some of them made it back, stumbling and soaked, shaking with cold and shame. Others were never seen again, their names whispered when the wind rattles the shutters at night. You live with that knowledge in the same way you live with the damp in your walls and the rot in your beams, as something constant, unpleasant, but ordinary. If you sat and thought about it too long, you might never set foot on the flats again. So you don't. You keep working, keep walking the slippery ground, keep trusting that the tide will give you time to finish what you've started. Because in the quiet seasons, the sea feels almost like a partner, even if deep down, you know she's only waiting for the day she'll decide to take back everything she's let you borrow. It begins as a small change, so slight you almost miss it. The air, which all morning has moved in gentle breaths off the sea, turns restless. The gusts don't come hard yet, but they arrive sharper, in sudden bursts that ruffle the drying nets and make the gulls pause in their circling. You feel it first on the skin of your face, a coolness that doesn't belong to the season, and then in the way it smells. Saltier, sharper, with a faint tang that stings the back of your throat. Some part of you, the old part that doesn't have words for warning signs, stirs uneasily. By midday, the wind has found its voice, and it isn't speaking kindly. It slips under the edges of the thatch and makes the roof sigh in long, low notes. Between the sighs are moments where it moans, the sound changing as it threads through the narrow lanes and gaps between houses, as though it's learning to speak in the language of your village. It carries the scent of seaweed torn from deep water, heavy and damp, along with something you can't place, metallic, sharp, almost like the air before lightning. The combination sits wrong in your chest, but you try to ignore it. Weather is weather. You busy yourself with the fishing gear because it's what there is to do, and because working with your hands is easier than standing still and listening. Nets lie in piles along the shore, still stiff with salt, and the boats are tied higher up the bank than usual, though the tide is creeping close enough to lick their keels. You loop rope around the mooring posts and pull it tight, testing the knots twice over. The wind yanks at the loose ends, making them snap like angry whips, and you mutter under your breath, as though cursing can keep the fibers from fraying. Your neighbor Tomas is out too, fussing with the heavy stone weights he uses to anchor his crab pots. He glances up at the sky every few minutes, his brow furrowed, but when you catch his eye, he just shrugs. There's no point in saying what both of you are thinking, that a few ropes and a handful of stones won't make a difference if the sea decides to come all the way in, but it's the only defense you have, so you carry on as though it matters. The wind shifts again, coming now from a direction that feels wrong in your bones. It drives the smell of salt straight into your nose, strong enough that it coats your tongue, and in its wake, there's a faint, unsettling taste of rot, as though the sea has dredged something up from the depths and sent it to you on purpose. It hisses through the grass along the dunes, bending the stalks all one way, and the sound blends with the faint slap of waves against the shore. The water is not rough yet, but it is impatient, rising and falling against the boats with more weight than it should at this tide. You work faster, hauling the smaller gear up toward the houses, wedging baskets between barrels to keep them from blowing away. The gusts are stronger now, pushing at your back hard enough to make you stumble. The thatch above your head shudders and whispers with each one, and the ropes in your hands feel suddenly thin and foolish. No more protection than twine against whatever's moving toward you from beyond the horizon. Still, you tie the knots, pull them tight, and tell yourself you'll be ready. But readiness is a lie here. You know it, even as you go through the motions. The sea has her own measure of strength, and she's been gathering it somewhere you cannot see, pulling it closer with every restless breath of this wind. The work you do now is the work your parents did before every bad night on the water, and their parents before them. And it has always been more ritual than safeguard. Rope and hope are all you have, and tonight you'll learn just how little that is worth. By late afternoon, the sky stops behaving like something ordinary and starts looking like it's been painted by a hand with bad intentions. The clouds, which had been drifting in soft gray bands, gather into warped shapes that seem to lean toward the shore, as if the wind has been pressing them into strange, unnatural angles. A bruise-colored mass builds low over the horizon, its edges frayed and curling like smoke, and above it a sickly greenish light bleeds into the air. You've never seen that color in the sky without trouble following close behind. It makes the water look wrong, too. Dull, heavy, as though the tide has turned to molten lead. The sudden chill creeps in without warning. One moment you're sweating from hauling gear, the next you're shivering as if the day has slipped into early winter. You rub your arms, telling yourself it's only the wind's fault, but the cold has a weight to it, sinking past your skin. Drops begin to fall. Not in a steady rain, but in scattered splashes big enough to leave dark spots on the dirt. They're cold enough to sting, and when one lands on the back of your neck, you flinch as though it's burned you. The smell in the air sharpens. A wet metallic tang mixed with the faint rot of something long drowned. People drift into the lanes, not to run or to panic, but to stand with their heads tilted upward, watching the sky as if it might answer questions. In the way of small villages, everyone has an explanation ready. None of them the same. Old Hilda swears she's seen a sky like this only once before, the year the plague took half her family, and she crosses herself 3 times without blinking. Tomas says the green light means the sea witches are brewing a fight between the winds, and you'd better keep an iron nail in your pocket if you want to walk home safe. One of the younger men insists it's the breath of a giant fish turning in its sleep beneath the bay, stirring the clouds above it. Each story is spoken with the quiet authority of belief, and you listen, not because you think they're right, but because no one here speaks of storms the way a scholar would. There are no words for pressure or currents, no talk of surge or swell, only omens and the memories tied to them. The truth is that the mechanics of the sea are as unknown to you as the workings of the stars. You can watch the tide change, you can feel the shift in the wind, but you cannot see the forces that build a wall of water far beyond the horizon. What you do see is enough to stir something deep in your gut. The shadows moving too fast across the water, the clouds thickening until the sky feels low enough to touch, the way the light bends strangely, as if the day is being smothered ahead of its time. Children are called indoors, their mothers hurrying them along with baskets still half full of whatever work they were doing before the light changed. The doors close, but people keep looking out from between the shutters. You keep your own eyes on the horizon, telling yourself you're just being cautious. But every shift of the clouds, every sudden gust that sends grit stinging against your cheek, feels like the sky leaning closer, taking measure. The air grows heavier with each passing minute, not the heaviness of heat, but of something waiting. The green light deepens until it seems to stain everything. The nets piled along the shore, the thatch roofs, even the pale faces of the people still outside. You can't tell whether it's dusk arriving early or the storm swallowing the day whole, but it doesn't matter. Whatever it is, it's coming. And though no one here can name the science behind it, though every explanation is a story handed down through the years, you all feel the same truth in your bones. Skies like this are not here to be admired. They are here to warn and to promise. You're used to the rhythm, to the ocean's breath moving in and out with something like patience. When the tide turns, you feel it in your bones before the first wet line on the sand draws back. Today, the feeling doesn't come. The water keeps holding the shore like a hand that won't unclench. At first, it's only a few finger widths higher than it should be, nothing that would make a stranger look twice. The boats sit a little prouder, ropes stretched a little tighter, their keels kissing water that usually leaves them be at this hour. You tell yourself you miscounted the bells. Maybe you lost track of time, but you didn't, and the sea knows it. Along the bank, the children have a game they play with the retreating water, chasing it as it runs away and then fleeing, squealing when the next ripple curls forward. Today the game doesn't work. The line creeps higher, not lower, soaking their toes and swallowing the just right stick. Someone pushed into the sand to mark the usual turning point. Old lines, thin with seaweed, float like careless stitches pulled apart. Even the flat mud beyond the creek doesn't show its veins of water the way it should. The channels stay glazed, the surface slick and stubborn. The flats are keeping secrets. People notice, not all at once, not with alarm, but with the same wary attention you'd give a neighbor who hasn't slept in days. Someone points to the piles at the little pier, where the dark band that marks normal high tide is already wet. Another squints at the salt pans behind the dunes, those shallow rectangles where brine is coaxed into crystals under a friendly summer sun. A thin ribbon of water has slipped over the lip of the first pan, blurring the edge between pond and ditch. It doesn't look like much, just a gleam, but it is wrong. The salt farmer hurries over, cursing under his breath, trying to pull sod along the edges to build them up. The water slides past his hands anyway, polite as a guest, and just as persistent. Arguing starts almost immediately, because that's what people do when the truth is too large to hold. Tomas claims this means the fishing will be good. His grandfather swore a stubborn tide brings shoals in close and keeps them there. Hilda says the opposite, that a sea that won't step back is a jealous sea, and jealous seas count heads. The miller's boy, who has learned a few new words from a traveling merchant and enjoys using them, calls it a breathing mischief, which is not a thing, but sounds convincing enough to make two women cross themselves. A younger fisherman grins with too many teeth and says, if the water wants to come closer, let it, a less distance to carry the catch. You don't bother reminding him that water close enough to touch your door is not a convenience. The pier becomes a measuring stick for disbelief. Planks that usually dry to a silver crust by this hour are still dark, and the barnacles that cling to the lowest rung, those gritty little worshippers of the tide's ankles, haven't been left blinking in the air. The shorter boats, the ones you drag out by hand, start bumping softly against the pier's side with a sound like a tongue clicking in disapproval. A coil of rope you left looped neatly on a post is now adrift, spinning like a trapped snake until you snatch it back. You tie it higher without thinking about why your knot looks ridiculous up there. It looks like denial. More water seeps into the salt pans and the brine clouds as sand breaks from the edges. You can almost see the season's work dissolving. The farmer lays boards and stones on the rim and fetches buckets to bail. But bailing a tide is like arguing with the moon. He keeps at it anyway, jaw clenched, because doing something feels better than admitting nothing you can do is enough. Down the strand, Agnes drags the rack of drying fish a few yards inland, then a few yards more, until the rack lists and one leg sinks into the softened ground. The fish smack against each other like wet pages turning. By now, the quiet has a shape. Conversations are abbreviated, all eyes cutting to the water between words. You feel the way the air presses on your skin, as if the day itself is holding its breath. The church bell sounds the hour you were waiting for the turn, and there is no turn. Just the tide sliding in by another inch, and then two, slow as a thief who has learned all the creaks in your floorboards. There is a heaviness to it, a sense of intent, the way a beast leans into a door before it decides to break it. Someone tries to make a joke about the saints wanting a bath. It dies halfway out of his mouth when a wavelet reaches his boot. He steps back quickly, cheeks hot, and scuffs the wet sand with his heel as if to erase the mark. The gulls on the roofline are quiet now, heads tucked but eyes open, and the dogs have chosen the dry thresholds of doorways, their paws just inside, their bodies ready to move. Across the creek, a slat fence, that keeps nothing in and everything out, tips backward and floats, easy as a cradle. Children are told to go inside and stop whining. They go, but they look over their shoulders the whole way. You stand with the others and watch the water do what it wants. This is not the roar of a storm or the panic of a squall. It is a quiet insistence, a decision being made far away that is now being carried to you in inches. You try to convince yourself it's a strange tide, a curious mood, a swell that will ease off once the wind changes. You try to believe the arguments you've just heard, because belief, even wrong belief, is warmer than dread. But the sea keeps failing to leave. It doesn't announce itself with a polite rise or the kind of swelling wave you've seen 100 times from the shore. There's no measured roll, no graceful crest curling under its own weight. When the first wall of water comes, it is already breaking, already tearing itself to pieces as it hurls forward. You don't see it form out at sea. You don't have time. One moment the wind is shoving rain against the shutters. The next, there's a roar so deep it feels like the ground itself has decided to speak. It's not the voice of the wind or the usual hiss of waves. It's something larger, heavier, a noise that carries grit in it, as though the sea has swallowed the earth and is now grinding it to spit back out. You're indoors because it's safer there, because everyone's been saying it's just a storm. The fishermen have seen worse. The roof has held through gales before. The tide is strange, but tides are strange sometimes. You've told yourself these things enough to believe them, until that sound rips through the village like the tearing of the world's largest sail. You're at the table when the first jolt comes, not from the wind shaking the walls, but from the floorboards themselves shivering underfoot. It's over in a heartbeat, replaced by the slam, the way something vast and solid meets the air with a force that seems impossible for water. The door doesn't burst inward right away. First, the sound moves past, an animal galloping, and then it's there, slamming into the side of the house. If you're close enough to a window, you might glimpse it, a churning mass taller than a man, gray-green under the storm light, flecked with foam and darker shapes that only make sense once they smash against something solid. Logs from the pier, crates torn from storage sheds, entire sections of fence moving as one with the water. This is not the sea you know. It doesn't arrive in waves you can count. It arrives as an argument already won. The wall strikes the unreinforced shoreline like it's been aiming for it all its life. The sound is more than noise. It's pressure, a fist pushing against your chest even from inside. The shingles overhead tremble, the thatch hisses under the rain, and the frame of the house groans in a pitch you've never heard before. Somewhere outside, something heavy crashes and splits, followed by the muffled yelp of a dog cut short. You think of the boats, but they're gone already, swept up in the first hit. Water finds the smallest ways in, between the door and its frame, under the threshold, through the gap where the shutter latch never quite fits. It isn't clean. It carries grit and splinters, the smell of churned mud, the sting of salt. It spreads across the floor in quick fingers that lap at the legs of stools and boots. You push at the door out of instinct, as though you might hold it shut against the pressure, but the boards shudder under your palms like the ribs of something breathing too fast. The breaker doesn't withdraw so much as slump, sagging back just enough for you to think it's over. You hear shouting outside, but it's all in pieces. Someone calling a name, someone else yelling for rope, the strange sharp sound of pottery breaking underwater. You move toward the window in time to see the second wave gathering behind the first, bigger now for having stolen what the first one left behind. Later, you'll realize the worst thing about that first wall of water wasn't how it hit. It was what it carried away. The edge of the pier is gone. The salt pans are indistinguishable from the flooded marsh beyond them. A section of your neighbor's house is leaning drunkenly, half its roof pulled off like a hat in a strong gust. And in the yard, where you were certain the drying nets had been weighted and safe, there's nothing but a few snapped posts and the churn of water still deciding which way it wants to go. For now, though, you just listen to the roar coming again, closer this time, and understand in the space of a single breath that this isn't just a storm. This is the sea, and it has decided it wants everything. It starts as a single crack, sharp enough to cut through the roar outside, and you think it's just a beam shifting under strain. Then another follows, deeper, wetter, the sound of something giving up. Within moments, it's everywhere. An endless chorus of wood splitting, nails tearing loose, ropes snapping in whiplash arcs. Boats go first. You can hear their hulls shatter against the pier, or what's left of it, before being swept up in the water's churn. The timbers that once smelled of tar and salt are torn apart like kindling, their pieces grinding against each other until they're nothing but jagged fragments. The barns don't last much longer. The wind has already pried at their roofs, and the surge finishes the job, ripping planks free and dragging them into the current. You picture the grain stores spilling like sand into the foam, sacks splitting open and vanishing before anyone can save them. Somewhere in the chaos, a yoke of oxen bawls in terror, the sound thick and ragged as it fights against the pull of water dragging at its legs. A fence breaks all at once with a sound like 100 bones snapping together, the posts torn from the softened earth, the rails spinning away into the flood. The noise swallows itself, layers of destruction folding on top of one another until you can't tell what's falling where. You hear the deep clang of the church bell, not rung by any hand but by the force of the wind and water rattling the tower. It swings wildly, tolling a warning no one needs now, its voice bending and warping in the gale. The air is thick with the shrieks of livestock, pigs squealing high, horses screaming low, mixed with the calls of people trying to make themselves heard over the water's constant battering. Words break apart before they reach you, scattered into syllables that mean nothing without their other halves. Inside, your own walls are speaking. The beams groan under strain, a slow, miserable sound that seems to travel through the floor into your feet. Somewhere above you, the roof shifts with a long creak, each gust of wind testing the thatch like fingers plucking at loose thread. The shutters slam hard enough to splinter the frame, but still they hold, the latch rattling like teeth in a cold jaw. The floor is slick now, water pooling faster than you can push it back, carrying stray bits of debris that knock into your ankles before drifting away again. There's no rhythm to it, no cycle of rise and fall you can track. One crash comes from far down the lane, another from the yard outside, and then something enormous smashes against the side of the house with a thud that shakes the walls. You imagine it's a section of someone's roof or the side of a shed, though it might be anything. The storm doesn't care what it picks up. You're holding your breath without realizing it, waiting for the next impact, flinching at every sharp report of wood breaking. The wind adds its own voice to the destruction, low and guttural at times, high and shrill at others, rushing through gaps and hollows until it sounds almost human in its rage. The rain on the roof is drowned out entirely, reduced to a background hiss beneath the crashing and the grinding. Now and then, there's a sound like a drum being struck, empty barrels rolling in the water, bouncing off each other and the walls they're trapped against. Then the bell tolls again, this time accompanied by a crash so loud you feel it in your chest. You don't need to see it to know the tower has lost part of its roof. The wind will take the rest before long. There is no pause, no moment to catch your breath, only the constant unraveling of the village, plank by plank, beam by beam. Every sound is a piece of your world being carried away. And in the middle of it all, you realize you're listening not just for what has already broken, but for the thing that will break next. It comes in low at first, curling under the door like a thief. You think you can push it back with rags and buckets, but the water doesn't just rise, it drives. Each wave that forces its way inside is heavier than the last, shoving chairs aside, upending baskets, pushing against your legs with a weight that feels almost intentional. It's not the slow seep of a river in flood. It's the battering of the sea, impatient and furious, throwing itself into the shape of your home. The hearth spits and hisses as the first rush reaches it, steam clouding the room and a damp heat that clings to your face. The smell is brine and rot and something metallic, as though the water has been sharpening itself on the bones of ships before it found your door. The floor is gone in moments, not physically, but in every way that matters. You can no longer see it, no longer trust where your feet will land. Objects bump against you in the dark water. A wooden spoon, a child's toy, the iron pot that was hanging by the fire an hour ago. Each touch startles because it might be something heavier, sharper, alive. You try to save what you can, lifting a chest onto the bed, stacking blankets higher, but the bed sags under the weight of soaked fabric and the rising tide. Before long, the mattress itself is afloat, bobbing against the wall with a slow, horrible persistence. It's not furniture anymore. It's just more debris. The first candle dies within minutes. You're still fumbling for another when the water catches the table leg and tips it, sending your only oil lamp into the current. It flares for a moment, a defiant yellow eye against the dark, before the flame vanishes with a hiss. The room is instantly smaller, the shadows thicker, the edges of everything uncertain. You can still hear the outside world, roaring wind, splintering wood. But in here it's muffled by the water's slap and swirl, like you've been pulled into some half-submerged cave. Every sound is close, intimate, and wrong. Your body begins to understand the cold before your mind does. It seeps in through your boots, up your legs, into the bend of your knees, settling heavy in your bones. The wet around you isn't just unpleasant. It's a weight that makes every movement slower. You brace yourself against the wall, trying to keep from being pushed off balance as each surge slaps against the door and sends another wave through the room. The walls shudder with the impacts, that constant dull thump that makes you think of the sea knocking to see if anyone's home. Salt water in your bed isn't just an inconvenience, it's a declaration. The place that was meant to be yours, your shelter from the world, is now part of the storm. Every soaked blanket, every warped board in the floor, every drifting scrap of cloth is proof that the sea is inside with you and it doesn't plan to leave. You feel the shape of the house differently now, not as a solid thing keeping you safe, but as a box filling steadily with a cold you can't stop. In the dark, you begin to bump into things you can't identify. Some are soft and yielding, others solid enough to bruise your shins. You grope for the shelf where the flint is kept, but your fingers find only the edge of a jar before it slips from your grip and vanishes into the water. Somewhere near the ceiling, the wind moans through a gap in the thatch, a strange high sound that makes the darkness feel deeper. The air is thick with salt and damp wood, a smell that will cling to you long after the water is gone, if it ever is. Then another surge hits, harder this time, and the bed shifts again, knocking into you. You catch yourself against the wall and realize there's no dry corner left. The sea has already claimed the floor, and it's working its way upward, slow but certain. Every drop in here used to be outside. Now it's in your hair, your clothes, your lungs. You understand, in that heavy silence after the lamp went out, that you're no longer keeping the storm at bay. You're living inside it. The cold doesn't start as pain. It begins as a shock that steals your breath, an instinctive gasp you can't control, even though you know the air is heavy with salt and damp, and something in it tastes like mud. The wool clinging to your skin turns instantly to lead, its scratch gone, replaced by the drag of waterlogged fibers pulling at your shoulders and waist. Linen, lighter, offers no comfort. It flaps and twists around you like strips of seaweed, tangling your legs when you try to move. The chill seeps in before you've even thought about escape, creeping through your fingers and toes until it meets in the middle, winding tight around your chest. It doesn't matter that you've lived your whole life by the coast, that you've waded the shallows since you could walk, that you've hauled nets in every kind of weather. This is different. This is the sea inside the village, inside your home, turning the familiar into something that bites. You try to shift your weight, to move toward a higher spot, but each step is a negotiation with the water's pull. It's not just resisting you, it's deciding where you will go, and the decision is never in your favor. The idea of swimming is absurd. The space is too tight, the weight of your clothes too much. Every movement costs more than it gives back. The first shivers come quickly, small at first, like a dog shaking off rain. But they grow, deepening into full-body jolts that make it hard to keep your balance. You brace against a wall, but the cold is inside now, moving faster than your blood can carry heat. You remember hearing, once, that the sea kills slower in summer, but it's no comfort. The water doesn't care about seasons. It cares about how long you can keep your muscles working before they refuse. That answer is counted in minutes, not hours. Your hands are the first to fail. They still move, but not as you tell them to. The fingers stiffen, refusing to curl properly, and the fine work, gripping a rope, untying a knot, striking flint, is gone. You fumble when you try to pull a floating stool toward you, and it slips away with the current. Soon your feet start to lose their sense of where the floor is, as though the cold is blurring the lines between your body and the water. The heaviness in your limbs spreads upward, a slow, steady numbing that's almost a relief until you realize it means you're losing the fight. The sea offers no stillness. Even when the water around you seems to pause, it's only to gather itself before the next push. The waves inside the house slap against your ribs, your hip, your jaw when you stumble. Each one robs a little more warmth, and with it, a little more strength. You think about climbing onto the table, but it's already unstable, rocking with every surge. Your bed is gone. The loft ladder, maybe, but even that feels like more than your legs can promise. Breathing becomes strange. The cold in your chest makes it feel as if each inhale is narrower than the last. Your teeth chatter without rhythm, knocking together so hard you taste blood where they catch your tongue. You try to will your body into moving faster, into some kind of furious action that might build heat. But every attempt feels sluggish, disconnected. The cold is clever that way. It makes you want to rest, to stop moving entirely, whispering that maybe just standing still will hurt less. Outside, the storm still rages, but its sound feels farther away now, wrapped in the cotton of your slowing senses. You know that's not because it's easing. It's because the cold is taking the edges off the world. The water is no longer a shock against your skin. It's simply there, pressing close, as if it's been part of you all along. You're not thinking about the next hour anymore. You're wondering if there is one. The idea comes to you the way desperate ideas always do. Sudden, bright, and almost convincing. If the village is drowning, then the sea must also hold your escape. You've seen men ride storms out before, their boats skimming over waves like water striders, nets forgotten in favor of survival. All you need, you tell yourself, is to reach the harbor, to find a fishing cog, or even a coracle, something that floats, something that moves faster than the water, chewing its way through the streets. But the harbor isn't a refuge, it's a graveyard in progress. The cogs, small enough for coastal work, squat low in the water, their planks already groaning from the strain. They're built for fair weather fishing, not for wrestling with a storm that eats horizons. Their hulls aren't sealed. Each wave is a fistful of water hurled inside, pooling at the bottom with no pump to throw it back out. Men use buckets, passing them hand to hand, but the sea pours in faster than their arms can lift. The decks gleam wet, slick enough to send you sliding toward the edge with one wrong step. The coracles look worse. They're little more than curved ribs covered in tarred hide, light enough to carry on your shoulder but light enough to capsize if a wave so much as sneezes in your direction. In calm water, they dance over the surface. In this, they're toys for the tide to flip. You watch one go over before it's even clear of the pier, its occupant disappearing into the chop. The boat rights itself a moment later, empty, spinning in slow circles until another wave claims it. You think about climbing into one anyway. The land is no safer. But the moment your hand touches a rope, you feel the jerk as the storm tugs at it, testing your grip. Even tied fast, the boat bucks and shudders, straining against the mooring as though it knows better than you. The spray stings your eyes and turns the air to salt water before it even reaches your mouth. Each gust shoves at you, reminding you that even standing on the pier is work, that the next misstep could send you into the same gray churn that's already claimed half the harbor. And out there, beyond the mouth of the bay, you can see the truth. The waves aren't lines anymore, they're walls. The troughs between them are deep enough to hide a whole house, the peaks tall enough to blot out the horizon when they rise. A small boat doesn't ride those waves. It disappears inside them, and sometimes it doesn't come back up. Even if you made it past the harbor mouth, the storm surge isn't just the surface water you see. It's a moving mass of the whole sea, heavy and relentless, carrying debris like weapons. A stray beam from someone's roof, sharp and splintered, could punch a hole straight through a thin hull. Once that happens, there's no patching it. Not here, not now. You've bailed water before, on calmer days when a rogue swell splashed over the side, and even then it left your arms aching. Now, the thought of trying it while the boat pitches hard enough to throw you against the gunwale feels laughable. Every moment would be spent between scooping water and clinging for your life, and the sea would still be winning. A bucket brigade of one is just a man tiring himself into the deep. So you stand there, one hand on the wet, fraying rope, and let go. The boat heaves away from you, swinging on its tether like it's relieved to be spared. You realize that leaving land in one of these isn't an escape. It's just agreeing to drown somewhere farther from shore. The storm doesn't care if you're waist deep in your home or sinking in open water. It will take you either way. Only the view changes. The thought of running feels almost sane at first. The water is in the streets, in the houses, dragging nets and barrels past your knees, but your legs still work. Land is solid beneath you, and there's the belief, stubborn and childlike, that if you just keep moving, you can get ahead of it. The flood is behind you, you tell yourself. The dry ground is ahead, somewhere. But on a medieval coast, there is no ahead. The land doesn't rise, it sprawls. The same flat stretch that made it perfect for fishing villages and saltworks now works against you, offering no vantage point, no hilltop to climb toward. There are no seawalls here, no engineered breaks to buy you a few extra minutes. Just the same damp earth and open fields you've always known, stretched out in every direction like a map that forgot to draw in the high ground. You can't even see where the water will stop, only that it's moving faster than you are. The ground is already soft from the tide's earlier games, and each step pulls more effort from you than the last. If you're wearing shoes, the mud grips them like a jealous hand, tugging until the leather twists and your ankle screams. If you're barefoot, it's worse. The mud slides between your toes, hiding sharp shells, the splintered remains of fences, the stray nails from broken barrels. Every step is a gamble. One wrong landing, and you're bleeding into salt water that's eager to find any open wound. Behind you, the flood moves without hesitation. It doesn't stumble, doesn't lose footing. It spreads, pouring into every dip and hollow, widening streams into rivers. You think you've chosen the right direction, away from the heaviest roar, but the water's already there ahead of you, curling around from another inlet, cutting off your path like it's been planning this for centuries. The sea knows this land better than you do. It's mapped every low place, every ditch, every forgotten cart rut that will funnel it closer to your heels. You try cutting across a pasture, thinking it'll be faster than the winding track toward the next village, but the pasture is worse. The sod tears under your weight, the black muck beneath it swallowing your steps whole. You pull one leg free, and the other sinks deeper, the mud sucking hard enough to make you stumble. You lose a shoe entirely, and there's no question of stopping to dig it out. You're half running, half lurching now, one foot protected by wet leather, the other raw against ground that's no longer just mud, but mud mixed with the things the surge has carried in. Fish flapping against your ankles, seaweed tangling in your toes, bits of thatch from roofs upstream. Your breathing turns ragged, each inhale thick with the smell of brine and churned earth. The wind doesn't help. It shoves at your chest, driving the rain sideways into your eyes, making you blink away the blur every few steps. You know you're slowing down, but the water isn't. It's in your ears now, that low, hungry sound of something massive coming closer. You can feel it in the soles of your feet when it slams into the earth somewhere behind you, a dull vibration that runs up your bones. And then the first tongue of it reaches you. Not the full wall, but a cold, ankle-deep rush that wraps itself around your legs before you can dodge. It's moving faster than you can run, curling around your calves, pulling at your balance. You push forward, but each step is heavier, the drag building until you're leaning into it like a man walking through a crowd that refuses to part. Another surge comes, knee-high this time, and you know, because your body tells you before your mind does, that you're not outrunning anything. You keep moving anyway, not because you believe you can win, but because stopping means feeling the water rise, and you already know it's not going to stop for you. It's not just water that's coming for you. The surge is a thief and a battering ram, and it carries the spoils of everything it's already destroyed. The first things you notice are the barrels, big ones, bloated with air, bobbing along at the pace of the current. They look harmless until one clips your hip, and you realize that in this water, even something meant to store fish can hit like a charging ox. Behind it comes a fence post, sharp and slick, spinning end over end, before it vanishes under the next wave and resurfaces a heartbeat later, still aimed at anything in its way. The carts are worse. Empty or not, they've got the weight of their iron fittings, the reach of their long handles, the unpredictability of wheels catching the current like they've learned to swim. You see one roll sideways into a wall and splinter, the pieces carried off to become smaller, faster weapons. Even the planks that look too slim to matter are dangerous. In this churn, they're not floating. They're traveling, and at the speed of the water that owns them. And the water owns everything now. It has taken rooftops, shutters, crates of salted herring, lengths of rope, and scattered them into a tumbling mix that fills the space around you. Each wave shoves a new assortment into reach. A half-smashed bench, an oar from a boat you didn't see sink, the glint of a metal cauldron spinning just below the surface. You don't always have time to dodge. Sometimes you just brace, take the hit, and hope it's to your shoulder and not your skull. The bodies come too, though you tell yourself not to look. At first it's livestock, sheep rolling in the water like sacks of wool, pigs thrashing until they vanish, a dog trying to paddle against the current, only to be swept past you with a limp stillness that makes your stomach drop. Then it's neighbors. Faces, you know, eyes shut, caught on the same debris you've been fighting to avoid. A man you bought mackerel from last week slams into the side of a building and disappears under a broken beam. You look away, but the water doesn't care what you can stomach. It brings the next thing anyway. Every blow matters more than it should. A fence rail catches your shin, and the pain is sharp enough to stagger you, but it's what comes after that you fear. The wood is old, weather-worn, and filthy. The sea has mixed its splinters with sewage, fish guts, whatever rot it scraped up from the shore and the village's own waste trenches. You know what even a small wound can do here. In summer, a scratch from a mussel shell can swell and fester until your leg refuses to bend. In this, With the water warm enough for bacteria and cold enough to slow your blood, an infection isn't a risk, it's a promise. You keep your hands up when you can, but the cold has made them clumsy, slow to react. A chunk of timber glances off your forearm, and the sting tells you the skin's broken before you see the blood. It mingles with the water instantly, a thin red thread unraveling into the gray. You try not to imagine what else is finding its way in through that tiny split. What invisible things the surge has brought with it from the fishing docks, the salt pans, the midden heaps at the village edge. The current is never just current. It's a moving pile of everything the storm has decided you don't get to keep, and everything it's willing to kill you with. You try to find a pocket of clearer water, but even when the debris thins, the next wave just fills it again. It's a tide that's part ocean, part ruin, and it treats you the same as it treats the barrels, the carts, the neighbors. You're just another thing for it to carry, break, and drop wherever it pleases. The water doesn't just carry salt and sand. It carries the village's secrets, the ones you hoped would stay buried in pits and ditches and the dark corners behind workshops. When the surge climbs over the thresholds, it yanks the lids off every foul thing you've ever tried to keep out of sight. Cesspits that have been silently filling for years burst like rotten fruit, their contents dissolving into the flood until the whole street stinks of what people never talk about in daylight. Chamber pots empty themselves without ceremony, the brown froth swirling into eddies that lap at your knees, your hands, your mouth, if you're unlucky enough to fall. You know exactly what you're wading through because the smell is undeniable, thick and animal and human all at once. It clings to the back of your throat, no matter how you try to breathe around it. Dead things are part of the mix. Not just the animals that couldn't outrun the water, though there are plenty of those, but the ones already dead before the storm. The midden heaps at the edge of the village, piled with fish heads and bones and whatever scraps no one had use for, come apart and join the current. The slaughterhouse off the lane gives up its runoff, blood diluted to a thin pink stain, offal turned soft by time and flies. Even the tannery contributes, because the tannery always contributes. Its pits of steeping hides, thick with lime and urine, and the dung used to soften leather, overflow into the same water that's now inside your boots. The sting on your skin isn't just salt. It's lie and waste, and the sour tang of old death. No part of the village is clean enough to be spared. The ash piles where you tossed yesterday's hearth sweepings turn to paste, floating in gray clumps that smear across your shins. The dung heaps meant for the fields crumble into the flood, and then rise again in fragile islands that break the moment you brush them. Even the churchyard lends its ghost of a taste. The ground there is higher, yes, but not high enough, and the water laps its stones with names you recognize and carries away the soil that kept them decent. You don't let your mind finish that thought. The water will finish it for you if you let it. You push forward because there's nowhere else to go, but each step is a promise you'll pay for later. The smallest cut becomes a doorway. Splinters from broken fences, shells ground to razors by the churning, the nail you didn't see until it kissed your heel. Each opens your body to whatever the surge has gathered. You feel the sting and think only of getting out of the street, out of the yard, anywhere that's not in the water's path. Survival is a narrow word in a moment like this. It means breathing for another hour, not what happens to the wound tomorrow. And tomorrow will come. If you're stubborn or lucky, you'll wake to a village that smells like a latrine soaked in brine. The floors will be crusted with a pale film when the water finally drops back, a salty scab over mud that squelches under every step. The fish that seemed like a blessing when they flopped into the lanes will lie in slimy drifts, attracting flies, and the goats that lived will nose the piles and cough. People will drag their belongings into the cold light to dry, and the drying will make the smell worse before it makes it better. Every fabric will hold the water's memory. Your hands will too. Then, the fevers will start. Not for everyone at once, There's a schedule to misery. But in ripples, the way the sea came in, someone will double over with cramps and spend a day on a bucket, shivering while the world runs out of them. Someone else will grow hot to the touch, then cold, then hot again. Eyes glazed, lips cracked, praying in a whisper because speech hurts. Children will stop playing and start lying down. The strong men who tied ropes and hauled neighbors through windows will stare at their own wounds and pretend the angry red climbing up from the edges is nothing important until it is. People will call it bad air, or God's test, or the price the village pays for its sins. Whatever the name, you'll recognize it as the storm's second tide. You'll think about the water's touch more than you want to. You'll remember the moment a wave pushed your palm against a floating plank and the skin slipped, and wonder if that was when it got in. You'll wash your hands in a bucket you swear is clean, only to remember that the well itself tasted like the flood when you hauled from it at dawn. You'll scrub and still feel unclean, because cleanliness isn't a thing this place can offer you, not after the surge has stirred the village from its lowest layers to its highest shelves. And the worst part is that you won't have an enemy you can see. The sea has already retreated a little by then, pretending to have finished with you. But it left behind a broth that will keep working in bodies long after the clouds lift. You may have kept your head above water, kept your feet under you, kept your family together through the night. You may have looked death in the face and told it to wait its turn. It will. It's the kind of danger you wouldn't imagine in a flood, the sort that seems impossible until you see it flicker across the black surface of the water. The sea has no business burning, but here it does. Patches of it licking orange and blue, where oil has spilled from overturned lamps or where a barrel of fish fat from the smokehouse has burst open and bled into the tide. The flames skitter like they've grown bored of logs and decided to see how far they can run. The smell is worse than the sight, acrid and greasy, mixing with the rot already in the air. Every shift of the wind brings a new taste of it to the back of your tongue. It starts inside the houses before it moves into the streets. The surge knocks a hearthstone loose, tips a pan of hot coals into the rushes on the floor, and before the water has fully claimed the room, the thatch overhead is smoldering. The flames have the advantage. Smoke moves faster than the flood, climbing through rafters and finding air pockets above the tide where it can feed without interruption. In the half-light, the fire's glow makes the water below look alive in another way, a rippling sheet of copper over black depths, as if the sea itself is plotting with the wind to finish what it started. You think about the lamp you knocked over when the first wave hit, how the oil floated out in ribbons before the wick was even cold. It seemed harmless then, one more thing to lose in the chaos, until you see that same slick curling around the leg of a floating table now, catching a tongue of flame that hisses but doesn't die. The water doesn't snuff it out. It carries it, nudges it along, helps it grow into a chain of little burning islands that drift toward the next wall of timber. The heat is strange in this cold. Welcome for a breath or two, then punishing. It singes hair, dries the salt on your cheeks into tight lines, makes you cough deep from the chest. The smoke hangs low over the flood, thick enough to blur the shapes of the debris and people around you. Figures appear and vanish in the murk, some shouting, some silent, all of them moving without a clear direction. You can't tell whether they're running from the water or the fire or both, and in the end it doesn't matter. There's no safe side to choose, and the fire spreads where you can't follow it. The roofs are the worst. Thatch catches so quickly, it's like the houses have been waiting for the excuse. One sparks, and then another, until the lane is lit in a jagged rhythm of orange and red, the reflection on the water dancing faster than your eyes can track. It makes escape harder, because now every door you thought might be open is shadowed by heat, every window rimmed in smoke. If you thought the dark was blinding, you hadn't met this half-light, thick with haze, unreliable, making you squint until your head aches. Someone tries to beat the flames back with a soaked cloth, but the water they use is the same that's feeding the oil. It splashes, the fire jumps, and then the whole effort is abandoned in favor of climbing to a higher beam. You're aware, in a distant way, that the smoke isn't just choking you now. It's in your clothes, in your hair, a clinging thing that will follow you even if you get out. You breathe shallow, but it doesn't help. Each cough sends a bolt of pain through your ribs, and you taste ash every time. The thought creeps in that this is how some will be found tomorrow, not drowned but curled in corners blackened by fire, the water still lapping at their boots. A crueler end, maybe, because it feels like betrayal. The flood should have been enough. But here is this second disaster, threading itself through the first, and you have no plan for it. You can't swim under it, you can't climb above it, and you can't put it out. Somewhere behind you, something collapses with a sound too loud to be wood alone. A rush of sparks scattering over the surface before winking out. For a moment the heat fades and the smoke shifts, but the relief is short. The water carries another burning slick toward you, slow and steady as breath, as if reminding you that in the surge, even the things that should save you can turn against you. And here, in the middle of it, there's no choice but to keep moving and hope you find a pocket of night that the fire hasn't yet learned to reach. When the water finally begins to slide back toward the sea, it doesn't feel like deliverance. It feels like a trick. The roar fades to a murmur, the waves shrink to ripples, and the street that had been a black river is suddenly a stretch of glistening mud. People lean out of upper windows, watching it go, their faces pale and hollow-eyed. A few venture down, bare feet slapping into the muck, and for a moment you think maybe this is the turning point. But then someone takes a step too far, and the ground swallows them to the knee in a wet, sucking grip that turns their scream into a raw, terrified cry for help. The flood hasn't left you with dry land. It's left you with a trap that looks like safety. The silt lies in layers, silky on the surface and shifting underneath, like a beast waiting to roll you under. Every footstep is a gamble. The weight of your body enough to pull you ankle deep, then calf deep, then further, until you need someone to haul you out by the armpits. There's no clear line between solid and not, and every rescue churns the mud looser, making the next step riskier still. What the water didn't take outright, it's hidden in this shifting ground. Fence posts, roof tiles, jagged planks, waiting just under the sheen to tear your souls open. Buildings stand, but not like they did before. The wood is swollen and warped, the nails holding it together loosened by hours of pounding water. Stone walls lean at angles so slight you could miss it until you hear the faint tick of mortar crumbling. Every doorway could be a loaded crossbow, the lintel one push away from dropping its weight on the next person to pass under. You learn to stand aside when someone tries a door, listening for the groan of strained beams. It's not the sea you fear now. It's gravity. The first collapses happen quietly, almost politely. A small shed folds into itself, the roof sinking like a tent when the center pole slips. Then a barn goes, one wall kicking outward in slow motion before the rest follows with a soft, muffled thump into the mud. By afternoon, the sound becomes familiar. Wood surrendering to rot. It didn't have yesterday. Brick deciding it's too tired to hold. You start to scan the skyline every few minutes, not for weather but for sagging ridgelines and tilting chimneys. And the holes. Those are worse. You can't see them until you're in them. The surge scoured out the earth under lanes and courtyards, leaving a crust of mud above empty space. A cart rolls over one and vanishes up to the axle. A man chasing a chicken breaks through to his waist and comes up bleeding from a shard of something buried down there. The luckiest walk away with only the fright. The others are carried, groaning, to whatever corner of the church still stands. No one talks about what happens if you're alone when you drop. You all know the answer. The smell lingers, as if the flood left a ghost of itself behind. It seeps from the mud and from the walls, a damp, mineral scent laced with rot. You breathe it without choice, tasting it on your tongue with every word you speak. It will fade, they say, but not soon, and not before it's worked its way into your clothes, your hair, the cracks in your skin where the salt water burned you raw. People move through this aftermath slowly, like they're afraid to wake something. Voices are low, eyes always darting to the ground before each step. Children are kept indoors, though indoors means little when half the roof is missing. Tools are fetched with care, as if the wrong vibration might bring the rest of a wall down. The night before was chaos, loud and wild and merciless. This is different. This is a silence that feels heavier than the water ever did. And in that silence, the thought grows that the danger hasn't passed. The sea might come back tomorrow, or next week, or next year. But even if it doesn't, the land you thought you knew is changed. It's softer, less certain underfoot. The houses you built to last generations now look like they're holding their breath. You walk home, if you can still call it that, knowing every step could be the one that drops you into the hole the flood dug when you weren't looking. And in that knowledge is the truth you don't want to admit. The water didn't have to stay to finish what it started. The flood doesn't just take what's above the ground, it poisons what's beneath it. In the first days after the water retreats, you can't see it. The fields look flat and wet, the furrows filled with a shine of pooled rainwater. You tell yourself, it's nothing a good sun and a week of dry wind can't fix. But the smell is wrong. Sharp, briny, like a fishmonger's stall left out in the heat. You taste it when the breeze shifts, that faint grit of salt catching on your lips. You know the sea has claimed the land, even though the tide is miles away now. When you press your heel into the soil, it squelches, and when you lift it again, the mud clings in gray, crusty lumps. That's not river silt. That's the residue of a storm surge that reached deep inland, dragging with it the salt that crops can't forgive. You might plant anyway, because what else is there to do? But you already know the truth. The barley will rise thin and yellow, the beans will twist and wither before flowering, and the root vegetables will rot in place, their flesh turning black and spongy before you can even pull them. You don't have the words soil salinity or alkalinity levels, but you have your own language for loss. You call it the sea's curse or the ground gone bad, and you remember the old stories about the earth refusing to feed those who have angered the gods. The elders will talk about floods in their youth, years when people boiled shoe leather for broth or stripped bark to grind into flour. They'll tell you to be ready for the same. The salt works its way into everything. Livestock wander the edges of the ruined plots, sniffing but refusing to graze. Wells taste faintly of brackishness now, and no amount of drawing or filtering will rid them of it. You watch your neighbors' faces when they drink. No one says it aloud, but they all feel it. This is not water that nourishes. This is water that takes. The hunger won't arrive in a rush. It'll creep in. At first, you'll eat the stores you managed to save, dried fish and smoked meat, rye flour kept safe on high shelves. You'll barter for what the inland villages can spare. But those villages will see their own prices rise as more and more mouths turn toward them. By winter, the loaves will be thinner, stretched with ground acorns or mashed reeds. Children will cry at night, not from the cold, but from the ache of a stomach that no longer remembers what it means to be full. You'll stand in the fields next spring, watching the green return in the hedgerows and the wild weeds, but your own plots will still look sick. The grass there grows in uneven clumps, sharp-edged and coarse, good for nothing but scratching the legs of anyone who walks through. The salt lingers deep, locked in the soil where your hands can't reach. Rain might help if there's enough of it over enough seasons, but that's a gamble you don't control. Until then, every seed you press into the ground is a prayer you know won't be answered. The village will feel the change before it admits it. Fewer feasts, fewer market days. Work will shift from planting to foraging, fishing, hunting, anything that keeps you from watching the earth betray you. You'll hear more talk of leaving, of finding new land where the sea's reach hasn't spoiled the ground. But the truth is, most won't go. This is home, even when it fails you. And besides, you've got no guarantee the next place won't meet the same fate. By the second year, you stop asking whether the fields will recover. You start asking how you'll live now that they won't. The salt is invisible by then, baked into the dust that lifts with every step, but it's in the bread that tastes flat and bitter, in the milk from cows forced to graze on weeds, in the marrow of your bones as you grow thinner. It's in the way the land looks at you, dull, spent, unwilling. The flood may have come and gone in a single night, but the famine it leaves will stay until it's taken its due. It starts with the silence in the byre. Before the surge, there was always noise, lowing, snuffling, the shuffle of hooves on straw. Now, the air is thick with the absence of it. You stand in the doorway, smelling salt and rot, and you know before you see. The water didn't spare what couldn't climb high ground, and most of them couldn't. Sheep penned in low fields were swept away. Pigs tied to stakes drowned where they stood. The cows fared no better, their heavy bodies no match for the sudden wall of water that smashed through stalls like paper. The carcasses show up over the next few days, some caught in hedgerows, others bloated and adrift in drainage ditches. The horses are the hardest to look at. Eyes filmed over, manes tangled with reeds, legs twisted in ways that speak of panic and pain. Children are kept indoors, but they hear the muttered curses and the thud of shovels hitting wet earth as the adults try to bury what's left. You can't burn them. The wood is too wet, and the smoke from green timber would draw the wrong kind of attention. So you dig shallow graves in the sodden ground, knowing the tide could undo your work at any moment. The survivors aren't a blessing. They come back hollow-eyed and skittish, their hides rubbed raw from debris, their feet cut and festering from hours in salt water. They won't eat what's left in the troughs. The hay is soaked through, black with mold before you can dry it. You watch a goat paw at the ground where a feed sack once hung, bleeding until its voice cracks, and you understand that hunger has already found them. It won't take long before it finds you. Disease comes fast in the damp. Flies swarm over wounds, and the smell of infection clings to the animal's breath. You see sores swell and split, leaking pus into the same water they drink from. A chicken wanders drunkenly in circles before collapsing, its neck bent at an unnatural angle. You don't know what killed it, but you don't want to wait to find out if it spreads. The healthy stock you had is gone. What's left is a gamble you're not sure you can take. There are no vets, no medicines beyond what you can mix from herbs, and the wet has washed even those from the gardens. You try poultices, salt rubs, prayers. None of it makes a difference. The animals weaken, their bodies too spent from the flood to fight off anything new. You wake each morning to one or two more gone, the barn quieter, the pens emptier. By the end of the week, you've stopped naming the dead. The loss is more than food. It's labor, it's trade, it's every plan you had for the months ahead. Without oxen to pull the plow, the fields you meant to plant will stay unturned. Without sheep, there's no wool for winter. Without the pigs, there's no salted meat to see you through the lean months. The village's wealth was on 4 legs, and now it's bloating in the sun or sinking into the mud. You feel the gap in the rhythm of daily life. No dawn milking, no bleating from the pasture, no clatter of hooves returning at dusk. Just the wind moving through empty pens and the faint creak of gates that no longer need to be latched. People avoid walking past the buyers unless they have to. The sight of them standing open, straw rotting in the corners, feels like a wound. What animals remain are penned tight, guarded more closely than children. You feed them from your own stores, knowing it shortens your future but unable to watch them waste away. You check their hides for swelling, their mouths for sores, willing them to survive long enough to breed, to restore some part of what was lost. But deep down, you know the truth, that even if they live, the land's poison and the coming scarcity will work against you. When the sea came, it took more than your walls and your crops. It tore the heart from your livelihood, left you staring at an emptiness that no amount of rebuilding can quickly fill. The storm was one night. The livestock loss is a death measured in seasons, each one poorer and hungrier than the last. And as you stand in the quiet, the absence feels louder than the flood ever did. It begins with the names, not the names of the dead. You'll never know them all, but the names of the places. Villages that once had a market day, a church bell, a patch of farmland by the shore. Names that were sung in ballads and carved into trading records. Names you could once walk to in a morning. After the surge, they don't just vanish from sight. They vanish from the world that counts. The scribes scratch them from the rolls, and the map makers stop drawing their outlines. In the records, they never existed. The chroniclers will mention them only in passing, a single line squeezed between a royal birth and a poor harvest. That year, God reclaimed the town of Hernewick, or the hamlet of Leesby, was lost to the sea. No elaboration, no list of the drowned, no note about the wailing in the streets, or the smell of smoke from burning timbers carried far inland by the wind. Just an impersonal record, a ghost sentence where a community used to be. You hear more in the taverns than in the monasteries. Travelers will tell you that if you walk to the old headland where Hernewick once stood, you can still see roof beams at low tide, barn doors yawning open beneath the water, nets tangled like weeds along what used to be the main lane. They say you can hear the church bell sometimes, muffled and warped by the sea, as if it's still ringing for vespers under the waves. No one knows if it's true, but no one laughs when they say it. For the survivors, there is no neat line in a chronicle. They carry the whole memory, heavy and jagged, in the only place it can still exist, their mouths. A mother will tell her children about the day the water came, about the boat she couldn't reach, about the faces she never saw again after the wave went dark. A fisherman will remember the exact smell of the wind an hour before it hit, the sound of the tide chewing through his neighbor's house. These stories pass from one tongue to another, each retelling keeping the place alive a little longer, even as the land it stood on sinks deeper into the sea's claim. But oral memory frays. Children grow up in inland villages where the sea is a rumor, and the names of drowned places mean nothing to them. They listen politely, then let the stories slip out of their minds. In a generation, the details will soften into cautionary tales about storms and sin, and another generation after that. Even those will be gone. The place will live only as a shape on the seabed, unmarked and unvisited, its people scattered and its name swallowed. Sometimes a merchant's ledger will turn up in an abbey, and in the margins you'll see a note about buying herring from a man in Hernewick or wool from Leesby. It will feel strange to see those names in ink, as though the village could be summoned back by saying them aloud. But the trade stopped, the markets closed, and the people who once spoke them with pride now say them only with loss. The sea has no need to remember. It takes what it takes, grinding wood to splinters and stone to sand, until the outlines of streets are just shadows under shifting water. What remains in human memory is fragile, dependent on someone choosing to speak it aloud. And in a time when survival leaves no room for sentiment, the choice is often to forget. The map changes quietly. New lines are drawn, old borders erased. Where once a dot marked a village, now there is nothing but the pale blue of the coastal shallows. To anyone born after, it will seem as though there was never a life there at all. And that, perhaps, is the final cruelty. Not the drowning, not the loss, but the erasure. That a place could live for centuries, full of laughter and work and prayer, and then vanish so completely that even the memory of it can be lost, like a name written in the sand just before the tide comes in. The ground is still wet when the digging starts. It has to be. The dead can't be left in the open, not with the heat that comes after the storm, and the flies already thick around the edges of the village. There's no time for markers or coffins, no space for the rites each family would have wanted. The work is about speed, not ceremony. Every able body that can still hold a spade is called to the task, and those who can't dig carry the shrouded forms, avoiding each other's eyes as they lower them into the earth. The smell is already heavy enough to make people gag. The salt water hasn't cleansed anything. It's just left the bodies damp and starting to swell, skin pale and stretched tight. Some are barely recognizable, faces softened into something strange by hours in the sea. Others bear marks of the violence the water carried, deep cuts from shattered beams, bruises from being thrown against stone. You don't look too closely. No one does. You keep your gaze fixed on the soil, on the simple rhythm of shoveling and throwing, because it's the only way to keep moving. There's no sorting the bodies by status, by family, by any of the distinctions that mattered before the flood. A priest lies beside a fisherman's wife. A merchant's daughter rests against the miller's youngest son. In death, they've all been pulled into the same tide. The priest who's still breathing mutters prayers as quickly as his voice will allow, trying to give each soul some measure of peace before the next load of earth comes down. But the words blur into each other, a steady drone against the thud of soil. Children are kept away when possible, but possible is rare. There's no one to watch them. So they stand at the edge of the field, clutching each other's hands, their faces tight and pale. Some will carry this sight all their lives. Others will push it down so far it will only return in dreams. Either way, it marks them. A child should not know the weight of a body, but here, they do. The pit grows deeper. It has to be wide enough to hold them all, and the count keeps rising as more are found in the debris or washed back by the tide. Each new arrival is met with the same grim efficiency. Wrap, carry, lower, cover. There's talk of plague, of the sickness that might come if the dead are left to rot in the open air. That fear drives the pace more than grief does. You bury fast because the living still need to stay alive. When the last body is lowered, the earth is smoothed flat over them, tamped down by boots until it's firm. There are no headstones, just the memory of where the ground was disturbed. A crude wooden cross is set at the center, not for each person, but for all of them at once. Names are spoken quietly among those who remember, but they are for the living now, not for the dead. The sea took their homes, and the earth now swallows their faces. There's no time to linger. The tide will turn again, and there are shelters to rebuild, food to salvage, livestock to find. People walk away from the fresh earth without looking back, because to look is to invite the weight of what's been lost, and that weight is too much to carry when the day's work is still ahead. Grieving will come later, if it comes at all. In this moment, survival stands first in line, and mourning waits somewhere far behind. The pit remains in the mind long after the storm is gone. It's a shape you see when you close your eyes, a smell that rises unbidden when the air turns damp. You tell yourself it was necessary, that it kept the rest of you breathing. But in the quiet hours, you remember the faces before they were wrapped in cloth, and the sound of shovels biting into wet soil, and the way the earth closed over them as if they had never been there at all. When the sea finally pulls back, the wreckage is not yours to claim, not entirely. You may think that the smashed timber of your house, the fishing nets tangled in the marsh grass, the barrels and tools that have drifted back into reach, these things belong to you because they were yours before the flood. But the law that governs your world says otherwise, and the man who enforces that law is already sending riders down the ruined lanes. Your lord arrives not with help, but with a ledger. His men mark the boundaries of what was once your holding, shaking their heads at how the tide has rearranged the land. They decide, without you, that your plot is no longer viable for crops or rent, that it must be reclaimed for the manor's use, or granted to someone who can make better of it. The words sound almost kind until you realize they mean taking it from you entirely. The sea might have drowned your kin, but it is the law that finishes the job, sweeping away the rest of what anchored you here. In the chaos after the flood, nothing is simple ownership anymore. The bodies of drowned livestock are claimed by the Lord's men for rendering, even if you raised them. Timber from a destroyed barn is carted away for repairs to the manor, even if it was your barn. If your nets are found by another fisherman from a neighboring estate, he may keep them without shame, muttering that the water chooses its own master. In theory, there are rules against this. In practice, the storm has made every man a scavenger, and your protest carries little weight without soldiers behind it. The looters are not always strangers. Some are your neighbors, their own stores washed away, their families hungry. They come quietly at night, stepping over broken fences and through the mud to lift what they can carry. You might wake to find your waterlogged grain sacks missing, or your last goat untethered and gone. In the daylight, they will not meet your eyes, and you will not accuse them aloud, because you know you might have done the same if your children were starving. There are worse kinds of thieves. Some come from farther inland, drawn by the scent of opportunity and disaster. They walk the beaches, looking for valuables spilled from drowned ships, coins, bolts of cloth, anything that can be dried and sold. A silver clasp taken from a dead man's cloak is worth as much as one from a merchant's chest, and no one is foolish enough to ask the source. The flood has blurred the lines between salvage and robbery until they no longer exist. And yet, the most dangerous taker is still your lord. He calls it reallocation, restoration of order. He says the land must be put back into productive use for the good of all, though you notice the new tenants are often his favorites, or men who have pledged him greater loyalty. You will not receive another plot inland. You will be told to work someone else's field for wages that vanish into taxes. If you are lucky, he will grant you a corner of your old home to live in until you can recover, which might mean the rest of your life. The law says you owe him labor and loyalty in exchange for his protection, but in the days after the surge, you see that protection is a word with conditions. He protects what benefits him. He claims what he wishes. And if you stand in his way, there are penalties for that too. Fines you cannot pay, service you cannot refuse, exile to another village that has no reason to feed you. The sea may have been merciless, but it was at least without intention. It did not choose who to drown and who to spare. The same cannot be said of the world you wake to now, where the wreckage is a resource to be claimed, and the survivors are merely another form of property. You think the hard part is over once the water leaves, but the worst of it is only beginning. The land you knew is salt-choked and gutted, your home half collapsed, the air carrying the stench of rot long after the last wave. The first frost will come before the soil can be coaxed into giving you even a handful of grain, and the fish that survived have scattered to deeper waters. Staying means slow hunger. Leaving means everything else. The idea of going inland starts as a murmur, an unspoken truth that passes from neighbor to neighbor until the words take shape. There is nothing for us here, but packing your life into whatever can be carried is not a simple matter. The roads are little more than muddy tracks, and each mile between you and the coast takes you deeper into land that already belongs to someone else. You do not cross those boundaries without cost. Villages farther from the sea look at you as though you carry the flood itself in your bones. They smell the damp in your clothes, see the hunger in your eyes, and hear the desperate pitch in your voice when you ask for shelter. You are not a traveler in need. You are a burden, another empty stomach in a place that barely feeds its own. The few who let you stay demand work in exchange for a roof, And it is always the hardest work they have, breaking stones, hauling timber, tending animals through the dark cold of winter. Others do not let you stay at all. They tell you to keep moving before you can step past the first fence. They bar their gates at dusk and watch from the shadows as you walk away. You cannot blame them entirely. They remember the famines, the years when one bad harvest killed as surely as war. They know that too many mouths can tip the balance from survival to ruin. You just happen to be on the wrong side of the balance. If you travel with family, the journey is slower and harder. Children grow weaker on thin food. Elders stumble over rutted paths. Each stop risks the loss of something. Another blanket traded for bread. Another tool left behind because the cart's wheel cracked in a pothole. Illness follows you like a shadow, carried in the damp of your bedding and the sores on your feet. The coughs start low in the chest and deepen as the nights grow colder, and you begin to understand why some choose to stay in the ruins by the shore. At least there, the graves are familiar. The inland towns are not the only danger. Bands of men wait on the less traveled paths, watching for the slow and the weary. They know you carry little worth stealing, but hunger makes even scraps valuable. A loaf of bread is taken as quickly as a coin, and no one rides to your rescue. There are no patrols for people like you. And still, you keep walking, because somewhere, you believe, there must be a place willing to take you in. You measure distance not in miles, but in the number of refusals you've endured. You stop asking for a bed and start asking only for water, because it is harder to refuse, and even the wary will sometimes spare a drink. You sleep in ditches, in the hollows of old trees, under abandoned carts, if you are lucky. Eventually, you may find a hamlet where the fields are wide enough to imagine another pair of hands could help. They won't give you land, but they might let you rent a corner of someone else's. You will be the outsider for years, the one who came from the drowned coast. They will tell stories about your people and your disaster, and you will learn to smile at them even when they get it wrong. Because this is what survival looks like now. Not returning to the life you had, but accepting the one offered to you no matter how narrow it is. The sea took the rest. It doesn't take long for the village priest to find the meaning in your ruin. The flood was not water alone. It was God's hand, sweeping away the unworthy, a scourge sent to cleanse and correct. You've heard this tone before in sermons about famine or plague, but never with such weight behind it. The sea came without warning, and in the absence of understanding, people reach for the oldest answer they know. Someone sinned, and all of you are paying for it. Whispers start among the survivors before the dead are even buried. Perhaps it was the miller's daughter, too free with her laughter and her hair uncovered in church. Perhaps the tanner, who worked on holy days. Perhaps the whole village, for forgetting the proper feast days or skimping on the tithe. It doesn't matter if you kept the fasts and lit your candles. Punishment in a medieval mind is rarely tailored. It falls wide, it falls heavy, and it falls on everyone. The church bells ring not in mourning, but in summons. People gather in the half-collapsed nave, the smell of damp stone and wet wool pressing in on the stale air. The priest stands before them, voice hoarse but strong, reading from a gospel that promises both wrath and mercy. He does not speak of tides or winds or the moon's pull on the sea. Those are not his tools. He speaks of repentance, of turning hearts back toward heaven, of walking barefoot to a shrine 100 miles away to prove your remorse. You find yourself nodding along, because what else can you do? If you can't fight the water, maybe you can appease whatever sent it. Soon the roads are full of pilgrims, not just from your village, but from all along the coast. They walk with staffs and bundles, chanting prayers in Latin they barely understand. Some drag wooden crosses behind them, splinters working into raw palms. Others wear sackcloth that chafes until the skin beneath weeps. There is an urgency to their movement, as though the flood could be called back by sheer devotion. You join them partly because it's easier than staying, and partly because the idea of doing nothing feels dangerous. If the Almighty is watching, better to be seen limping toward a holy place than mending nets in a ruined harbor. On the way, you pass towns untouched by the surge. Their churches are dry, their streets clean, their markets busy with goods from inland fields. The locals watch your procession from doorways, eyes narrowed in something between pity and suspicion. Some drop coins or bread into outstretched hands. Others spit, as though your misfortune might be catching. You keep your gaze low and keep walking, feeling the road's stones through thin leather soles. At night, the pilgrims huddle in barns or under hedges, trading stories of the flood. Details grow with the telling. The wave as high as a castle wall, the sea creatures stranded in fields, the phantom lights seen dancing on the water before it struck. Between these tales, someone always slips in a reminder. This was a judgment, and judgments mean guilt. The harder you walk, the more you pray, the more you might convince yourself you can undo it. The holy sites swell with bodies, the air thick with incense and sweat. You kneel until your knees ache, press your lips to cold relics, and drop your last copper into a box carved with saints. The clergy bless you, and for a moment, you feel lighter. You think maybe the flood's memory will fade, replaced by the rhythm of prayer and the comfort of ritual. But the road back will still pass through the bones of your village, and the sea will still be there, waiting. Faith offers no maps for rebuilding. It only tells you that the destruction meant something, even if that meaning changes depending on who is speaking. You can't say whether it's true, but you walk anyway. Because in a world without science, the only thing more frightening than divine wrath is the thought that the flood meant nothing at all. You would think the wreckage would teach caution, but hunger is a faster teacher than fear. The shore is where the fish are, where the salt pans can be scraped, where trade boats might one day return. So the ruins are not abandoned for long. Charred beams are dragged aside. Timbers salvaged from wrecked hulls are hammered into new frames, and thatch is patched over the same muddy footprints that the sea has already claimed once. It feels like progress, but it's really repetition, wearing the mask of resilience. The soil still smells of rot when the first huts go up, and every post driven into the ground sinks just a little too easily. No one talks about whether the earth is stable enough to hold, because what choice do they have? Inland fields belong to someone else, someone who won't welcome squatters. The Lord's tax collectors won't accept the excuse that your home was washed away, only that you can't pay. And you can't pay if you aren't hauling fish from the same harbor that nearly drowned you. The logic is circular, and the circle always brings you back to the tide. Masons work with whatever stone hasn't been stolen or tumbled into the marsh. Carpenters use planks still damp with salt water, and every swing of the mallet sends up the smell of the sea like a ghost that refuses to leave. Mothers spread reed mats over warped floors. Fathers argue over whether to face the doorway toward or away from the water, as though the direction might matter when the next surge comes. The debate is less about safety than about the memory of the night it all fell apart, and which way they want to be looking when it happens again. The church is rebuilt first, of course, because without it the village has no anchor. It stands on the same foundation stones, even though the surge undermined them and the mortar is still flaking. Bells are rehung in the belfry, their tone just a little duller from the brine. When they ring again for Mass, the sound is both triumphant and eerily hollow, as though it knows the sea has not finished speaking. The priest blesses each new home with water from the font, the gesture blurring the line between sanctification and irony. Merchants return, first as cautious visitors, then as part of the rhythm again. They bring iron nails, coarse cloth, and the rumor that in another town, far to the south, a surge swallowed half the market square. The story is told the same way every time, that they rebuilt in the same place too, and no one in your village sees that as a warning, just a sign that this is how life is lived. Children born after the flood grow up hearing stories of that night, As if it were a battle the village fought and won, instead of barely surviving. They play in the shallows where the water first came rushing in, their feet finding the same slippery stones their parents tripped over in panic. The past is recast as a kind of initiation, proof that the village belongs here because it endured. No one says the truth aloud. That belonging is not the same as safety. When the first winter storm rattles the shutters of the new houses, everyone goes quiet for a moment, listening. The wind has a memory, and it likes to tell it in the dark. You lie in bed, counting the heartbeats between gusts, smelling the faint tang of salt in the air. It's not the surge, not yet, but you know it will come again. And when it does, the sea will find you in the same place because you've left it no work to do. It doesn't have to hunt you. You've built your own trap and called it home. Some will tell you that survival is about strength, or swimming, or some hidden knack for sensing danger. But in a medieval storm surge, living through the night is mostly about being in the right place when the wrong thing happens. The rare survivors are not necessarily the fastest or bravest. They're the ones who happen to be hauling a cart up the hill when the first wall of water strikes the harbor, or who made the long climb to the monastery for a saint's feast day and found themselves above the reach of the tide. Monasteries are not built for storms, but for eternity. Or at least, that was the intention. Perched on rocky outcrops or nestled on the shoulders of hills, they stand where the sea can't easily spit its rage. Those within their walls on the night of the surge watch it from above, the moonlight catching on the churn and froth as the village below folds in on itself. They hear the wind like a living thing, low and mournful against the cloister stones, but they feel the ground steady beneath their feet. It's safety bought not by foresight, but by centuries-old building decisions meant to keep monks close to God and far from temptation. Others survive because of livestock. Strange as it sounds. A shepherd sleeping in a hut far from the shore, watching his flock on the higher grazing slopes, wakes to the unnatural roar and sees the sea climbing where it shouldn't. He gathers what he can and drives the animals farther uphill, and in the dim hours after dawn, he looks down at a coastline that no longer resembles the one he knew. He's alive not because he was prepared for disaster, but because sheep can't eat salt grass. Fortifications sometimes save lives, though they're rarely meant for water. A small stone keep, more watchtower than castle, may stand like a stubborn tooth above the plain. If the gate is open when the surge arrives, people pour in, desperate and dripping, the cold biting into their bones. The walls shudder as debris-laden water rams the base, but the stones hold. In the cramped dark, they press together for warmth, strangers bound by the same terrible luck of being here instead of there. Outside, the current strips away carts, fences, and the lives of those too far to reach shelter in time. A handful survive on instinct alone, climbing trees or clinging to roof beams that drift into quieter backwaters. These stories are told with the embellishment of miracle, each retelling sanding off the raw terror and replacing it with a sheen of destiny. The truth is that most who try to ride the flood this way fail. The branches snap, the roofs roll, but every disaster leaves behind its Lazaruses, and their continued breathing becomes proof, for some, that survival can be chosen. When the water pulls back and the survivors emerge, they're marked, not just by the cuts and bruises, but by the knowledge of what they saw from their safe height. It's one thing to endure the fury of the surge from within it, the world reduced to the next lungful of air, the next handhold. It's another to watch it swallow everything from above, powerless to help. That vantage point carves its own kind of wound. The survivor's gratitude is often tangled with guilt, and guilt grows heavy when it's shared in whispers over the shallow graves of neighbors. Years later, their names will be remembered in the village, though not always kindly. Some will be envied, others suspected of cowardice for being absent when the sea came. But in the first days after the flood, they are the ones who help dig, who help carry, who guide the lost to what remains of shelter. They are proof that it was possible to live through the night, even if most didn't. And in a place that rebuilds in the same shadow of the tide, that proof is a dangerous kind of hope. In the months after the sea recedes, when the ruins begin to look less like wreckage and more like part of the landscape, the stories start. They are whispered at first, over low fires and in the corners of taverns where the damp still clings to the air. You hear of the fisher who tied himself to the mast of his boat and rode the surge all the way to the next bay, stepping off as though he had merely crossed a river. You hear of the young girl who climbed the steeple in the dark and sang hymns until morning, her voice carrying over the roar like a bell that wouldn't drown. The tellers don't mention that the fisher lost half his fingers to frostbite, or that the girl's throat was ruined for months. Those parts don't fit the shape of legend. The minstrels arrive before the fields can even be sown again. They travel light, with lutes and battered boots, following the smell of cook fires and the promise of coin. Their songs are stitched together from rumor and fragments, embroidered with rhymes that make the flood sound almost merciful. They sing of courage, of cleverness, of lovers reunited on high ground. They don't sing about the starvation that followed, or the sickness, or the way entire families vanished without a trace. A ballad doesn't need those truths. It needs a chorus people can raise their mugs to. Children grow up with these songs in their ears, learning the verses before they can fully grasp what they mean. For them, the flood becomes an event half real and half imagined, a story world where the waves are tall as castles, but somehow never claim anyone you know by name. They hear about the night the ocean walked into the village and was driven back by the courage of a handful of men with nothing but nets and prayer. They aren't told that most of those men never came home. The survivors themselves sometimes play along, though their memories are harder and colder than the songs allow. In the quiet hours, they remember the smell of the water when it broke through the door, the pitch-black cold of it closing over their heads. But in company, they tell the other version, the one with the moment of triumph, the daring leap, the miraculous rescue. It's easier that way. The audience leans in, the listeners smile, and for a while the teller can pretend it was just a great storm, not the night everything ended. Over time, the flood stops being a thing that happened to people and starts being a thing that belongs to the village, like a relic or a coat of arms. It is sung about at fairs and recited at weddings, invoked as proof that the people here are made of sterner stuff than those inland. Newcomers are told the old tales before they are told the safest paths to the fields. The water becomes an adversary they defeated, rather than a force they barely endured. This is how the tide turns into myth, through the slow erosion of fact by repetition, through the warmth of a good melody sung often enough that it feels like heritage. Each retelling smooths the sharp edges until you can hold it without cutting yourself. The hunger fades from the story. The smell of the mud fades. The graves fade. What remains is something you can pass down without flinching, something you can be proud of. And yet, beneath the applause and the laughter when the final chord rings out, there is a private knowledge held by those who were there. They know the real song is one without words, only the endless roar of water and the shouts that no one could hear. They know that the sea is not finished, and that one day it may return without warning, with no ballad left to soften its arrival. In the weeks after the surge, when the smell of rot still hangs in the streets and the wells run brackish, talk turns toward miracles. Not the kind you can measure or prove, but the kind that grow in the telling until they are no longer bound by the limits of the real. Someone swears they saw St. Nicholas himself standing on the cliff above the harbor, his robes whipping in the gale, holding back the waves with an upraised hand. Another swears it was the Virgin, her veil gleaming in the lightning, her gaze fixed on the little chapel that somehow stood when every other building crumbled. The details shift depending on who is telling it, but the conviction is unshakable. You can't argue with a miracle. In every settlement along the coast, there is at least one survivor who refuses to speak of luck or chance. They insist they were saved by holy intervention. An old woman claims she clutched her rosary and felt a warmth spread through her chest as the waters rose, guiding her to a floating beam that carried her to shore. A boy says he prayed to the relic in the monastery, a fragment of bone said to belong to some obscure martyr, and woke up tangled in fishing nets on high ground. No one asks too many questions about how these things happened. Survival needs a reason, and divine favor is as good as any. Pilgrims begin to arrive before the mud has even dried. They come to see the chapel that stood, the crucifix that was found upright in the debris, the statue of Saint Brigid that was washed 3 miles inland and set down gently in a meadow, as if by careful hands. People kneel before these objects, pressing their foreheads to damp stone, leaving coins and candles in gratitude for lives spared, whether their own or those of strangers. The locals, still patching roofs and digging graves, accept the offerings. They know the difference between relic and refuse is often just the story attached to it. Clergy seize the moment, weaving sermons that bind survival to piety. They tell the congregation that the flood was both a punishment and a gift, a reminder of the frailty of mortal flesh, and proof that God will pluck the faithful from the jaws of destruction. For those who lost everything, this explanation offers an uneasy comfort. It suggests their suffering was not meaningless, that the deaths were part of some divine arithmetic only heaven understands. The alternative, that it was random, that the sea rose without reason, feels unbearable. The so-called miracle sites become woven into local faith, destinations for processions in the years that follow. On the anniversary of the surge, people walk barefoot from the village square to the chapel, carrying candles through streets that once lay beneath the tide. Children are told to touch the surviving relics for protection, to cross themselves at the place where the waters stopped. Even those who doubt the divine hand keep the traditions. In a place where the sea can take everything in a single night, no one wants to be seen turning away any form of protection. Stories multiply, each one more embellished than the last. The man who was pulled from the flood swears he saw a shining figure underwater, guiding his arms toward a rope. A mother insists that an invisible hand pushed her child up onto the roof seconds before the wall of water tore through their house. The truth, if it ever existed in a plain, unadorned form, is swallowed by the need to believe that something more than luck was at work. Faith becomes a kind of armor, thin, but better than facing the sea bare. And somewhere in all this, the memory of the cold water, the sound of everything breaking, the stench of the dead begins to blur. What remains are the images people choose to hold on to. A figure in robes on the cliff, a chapel still standing, a bone in a gilded reliquary that somehow escaped the flood's grasp. It's easier to remember the miracle than the drowning. Easier to pray for protection than to accept that the sea will come again, and saints may not come with it. You imagine yourself in their place, but you give yourself too much credit. You picture your modern reflexes, your survival tips gathered from television and the internet, your certainty that you'd spot the danger in time. But strip all that away. No forecasts, no emergency alerts, no waterproof gear, no helicopters waiting to pluck you from a roof. You're barefoot on muddy ground, wearing wool that grows heavier by the second, surrounded by neighbors whose only plan is prayer. The wind begins to howl, and you don't yet know it's already too late. The first wave wouldn't kill you outright, though it would try. It would slam into the side of your home, shoving the walls in as if they were only painted cloth. You'd be thrown in the dark with the smell of smoke, salt, and broken timbers pressing in on every breath. You'd be choking before you even made it to your knees. And there's no light, no electric torch to slice through the gloom, no illuminated exit sign to aim for, only black water hiding the next thing that will crush or cut you. Even if you clawed your way into the open, the sea would still be inside the village, moving like a living thing with its own rules. It would carry barrels, beams, and screaming animals as casually as twigs, each one spinning into you with bone-snapping force. You wouldn't see them until they hit. You couldn't swim in that kind of chaos. Your head would go under, your limbs tangling in rope or net, your lungs burning for air that wouldn't come. That's assuming you hadn't already been dragged sideways into a channel or hole you didn't know existed. Cold would take you just as quickly as impact. Water at that temperature is a thief, leaching your body heat faster than panic can keep your heart racing. You'd be shivering violently in minutes, numb in under an hour, if you somehow lasted that long. Wool and linen become anchors when soaked, dragging you down every time you try to surface. And there's no dry refuge above the flood, no attic safe from the rising tide. The roofs are thatch, ready to cave in beneath your weight. There's no climbing to higher ground when higher ground doesn't exist. The coast is flat as a table, stretching for miles without a hill to break the horizon. The nearest monastery or fortified manor, the kind of place that might survive, is half a day's walk away in good weather, and now the roads are gone. Every step on open ground is a gamble with mud that swallows your legs or currents that pull you sideways. And if by some combination of luck and sheer will you made it to the moment the water began to retreat, you'd find no safety waiting. The flood leaves the ground rotten and shifting, buildings standing just long enough to lure you close before collapsing in a sudden snap of beams. It leaves corpses, human and animal, fouling every pool and street. The air is thick with a stink that makes your stomach twist, and your skin itches from cuts now soaking in sewage and tannery runoff. Even the cleanest water you can find will likely kill you in days. There is no aid coming over the horizon, no trucks loaded with blankets, no medics with clean bandages, no helicopters dropping supplies. The people left are the only help you have, and most of them are too injured, grieving, or stunned to move. The rest are watching their own food supplies dwindle and wondering if taking yours is the only way to see another week. You wouldn't last a day, not because you're weak, but because the place, the time, and the disaster are built to break you. The storm surge doesn't care if you can tread water or read a tide chart. It doesn't care that you've promised yourself you'd fight to the last breath. It comes with enough weight to crush ships, enough reach to swallow towns, enough cold to stop a heart still beating. You wouldn't see it coming. And even if you did, you'd have nowhere left to run. You live in an age where the sea still kills, but at least it sends you a text first. You can see the storm forming on a glowing screen days in advance, the swirling satellite image, like an angry god, you can zoom in and out of with your fingertips. You hear the weather anchor's voice on the radio warning of storm surge risk and evacuation zones, words your medieval ancestors never had because they never had the chance to name what was coming. Now, you can drive away on roads raised above the tide line, cross bridges engineered to withstand a century's worth of tempests, and sleep inland in houses that don't sweat salt water through the walls. In the present, you can argue about whether sea walls are too ugly or too expensive without realizing they're a kind of magic. Concrete barriers that tame waves taller than houses, steel floodgates that close with the precision of a watchmaker's gear, pump systems that suck water away faster than rivers can spill it in. All of it built for the singular purpose of giving you a fighting chance. In the Middle Ages, the coast was naked. The only thing between you and the incoming tide was prayer, and whatever driftwood the last storm left behind. And when disaster does come, you have helicopters that hover like mechanical dragonflies, plucking people from rooftops. You have rescue boats with engines that roar against the current, instead of bending to it. You have thermal imaging to find you in the dark, generators to keep hospitals lit, desalination plants to make seawater drinkable. Medieval villagers had none of that. The same flood that took your home would take your hope, and no one would come looking because there was nowhere to look from. It's not just the machines, it's the rules. You have emergency hotlines, aid agencies, evacuation shelters with blankets and hot soup. People keep lists of the missing, and governments send soldiers not to seize your land, but to keep looters away from it. In the medieval world, loss was your new reality, and the law was less concerned with your survival than with who would inherit your drowned plot of soil. The sea might have taken your family, but the aftermath could take whatever was left. And yet, for all your modern defenses, there's a humility in knowing the ocean could still unmake you. That all the forecasts and reinforced levees and satellite feeds are just layers of fragile glass between you and the same force that once erased villages so completely their names exist only in half-remembered songs. You're safer now, but safety is not the same thing as invincibility. The tide still waits for its moment, and you still live at its pleasure. So you walk along the present-day shoreline and watch the gulls wheel above the foam, feeling the wind lift the hair from your forehead. The air tastes of salt, but it's only salt, not sewage, not the stench of rot. You think about how a storm surge today might flood streets and take power lines down, but you'd still be counted among the living because someone thought to count you. You think about how the medieval version of you wouldn't even have a grave that lasted the century. You thank the engineers, the meteorologists, the rescue divers, the quiet armies of people who push back the edge of the water, so you can forget, most days, that it's always coming for you. You thank the present for buying you time and choice, for giving you warning before the sea's hand closes. But you keep the awe and the fear close, because they're the only honest response to a truth the centuries haven't changed. The water still owns this place. You're just renting